Today, I'm going to show you how to make a very simple tincture. So we're going to use the folk method. The folk method is probably the oldest way that we've known to make tinctures. That's where you don't have to worry about fancy measurements or expensive equipment. You're actually just kind of feeling out how much plant matter to use, and you really only need a clean jar, some plants, and today we're going to be working with 100 proof vodka. So for simplicity's sake, we're going to talk about tincturing at home with 100 proof vodka today. There's a few advantages to working with 100 proof vodka. My favorite one is that for many plants, now this is not true of all plants, okay, but for many plants, you can use 100 proof vodka whether you have dried the plant first or whether you're using fresh plant material. That's because it's high enough in alcohol to sort of mitigate some of the water content. Again, that's not true for all plants, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to talk about pine needles, rose hips, and juniper berries. These are three things that we are moving into the harvest season for. These things are particularly great to have on hand over the winter in our home apothecaries because they have antimicrobial properties, anti-inflammatory properties, antioxidant and immune supportive properties, and they help with the respiratory system, as well as other effects like cardiovascular support from the rose hips and kidney and bladder support from the juniper berries. So before you decide to dose herbs, be sure that you're doing your homework, making sure there's no contraindications with your pharmaceutical prescriptions, but also just working with a professional to make sure that you're taking the herbs that are right for you. So today I just want to show you how simple the method is. I have some eastern white pine needles, and here where I am in Middle Tennessee, there are about 4 species of pine trees. They can all be used medicinally. So wherever you are, just figure out which species you have. The one to proceed with caution on would be ponderosa pine when you are pregnant, and that's a whole other conversation. There's no actual research that it can negatively impact humans, but it does negatively impact ruminant animals in their pregnancies. So these are my 5 needles to a bundle leaves, and that's how I know this is an eastern white pine. So here I want my clean empty jar, and all I'm going to do is start to chop up these pine needles into much smaller pieces. I'm going to do this into a bowl because it can be hard to get them excuse me, into a jar. So these pine needles are not completely fresh, but they're freshly dried. So again, you can work with fresh green needles, or you can dry your needles and then process them into a tincture, shortly thereafter. If I am drying herbs, I always want to make sure that I use them soon after the drying process, because over time they will decrease in potency. They won't go bad necessarily unless you see that they've molded, but their effectiveness will start to reduce over time. So freshly dried is the way to go. If you don't know where to harvest pine needles, you can try to figure out if your area has a local foraging group. You can probably order these as well, but you want to make sure that if you are ordering them, they're from reputable sellers who really are selling you what they say they are, and make sure that they haven't been drying out for years before you buy them, right? So they will still be green if you have good quality pine needles. So while I'm processing these needles, it doesn't have to be precise. As you can see, I'm just cutting them into smaller pieces because we want to expose more surface area so that we can have a more powerful medicine. But why would I want to tincture pine needles in particular? So pine needles have infection fighting properties. They are antibacterial and antifungal. They also have an affinity for the lungs and the respiratory system. So that means anytime I'm going to have any sort of respiratory issue, I will want pine on hand. So from your typical cold and flu to like bronchitis or more serious issues with the lungs. Next, pine needles have expectorant properties. So that means they're really good at clearing out like the stuck mucus when you're congested. I was reading in one old herbal that it's very specifically indicated when you have that kind of thick green mucus that's really hard to get out of your lungs and your sinuses. Pine needle can really go in there and soften that up, open up the passageways, and help you expel that mucus. Pine needles are anti-inflammatory, so they can help with any sort of inflamed condition. They also have antioxidant properties, so they're going to boost your body's immune system capacity in order to help you get through whatever is affecting your body at the time. So very good medicine to have on hand in your medicine cabinet. And a tincture, the reason I like tinctures is because they are shelf stable forever. So as long as you have done it properly and strained it properly, that tincture is never going to go bad. You can always make your old tinctures more potent by adding new fresh plant material, but you're never actually going to have to throw out that old tincture no matter how long you've had it sitting in your apothecary. Tincturing is also a very accessible way to make medicine because it doesn't involve a whole lot of steps or a whole lot of time. You can use what you have. So I am now just going back and kind of chopping up these pine needles a little bit more with my scissors. And at this point, I'm going to start putting them in my jar. Now you can use, a funnel that's good for mason jars if you want to. I forgot to grab that, so I'm just going to add it by hand. And again, we're using the folk method. So we're not worried about measurements. We're not worried about weighing out how much pine needles are going in the jar. We're just putting needles in the jar. And in general, if your jar is about half full, then that's a pretty good amount of plant material to have. Okay, so here I'm a little over half full of my chopped eastern white pine needles. And at this point, I'm going to take 100 proof vodka and I'm going to fill my jar all the way to the top. You don't want a lot of space because you don't want air in your jar. So I'm going to fill it to the top. You can see how full that is. I'm going to seal it tightly, and then I'm going to shake it up. This is now going to sit on in a cool, dark place, so maybe like in a cabinet for about 6 weeks. And if I think of it, I'm going to shake it whenever I think to. Now, if you don't shake it, it's still going to be medicine. You can't mess it up, okay? Can't mess it up. So the really important part is to make a label, because no matter how much you think that you're going to remember what's in every single jar, and when you put it in there, you're not. So I'm going to write pine needle. I'm going to put what species it is. I'm going to put that I used 100 proof vodka, which is 50% alcohol. So the percent of alcohol is always half of what the proof is. So if you have 80 proof vodka, that's 40% alcohol and 60% water, if that makes sense. So 100 proof alcohol is 50% alcohol and 50% water. So when you're extracting plant medicine, depending on what liquid you're using, you can draw out different properties of a plant. And so it's nice to use a vodka because you're drawing out some of the water soluble properties as well as some of the alcohol soluble properties of that plant. So I'm also going to put today's date on here. That way I will know when it will be ready to strain. After my 6 weeks are up, what do I do? Okay, I'm going to take this jar. I'm going to get a small sieve or strainer or a cheesecloth or even a coffee filter if you don't have any of those things. And I'm just going to strain it through that so that I capture the plant material and I reserve the liquid. Now that liquid is your tincture, and that's going to go back in a jar, and that's what's good. That's what stays on your shelf and is good for a long time. If you want to dose this as a medicine, in general, for something like a respiratory illness, the way that I would dose a pine needle tincture, let's say I started to get congestion, some sort of respiratory infection, cough, cold, I might take a 1/4 teaspoon of pine needle tincture every 2 hours for a few days while I was sick. You can take it longer than a few days. And sometimes when you actually feel a lot better, you might still want to take it for 3 more days, 3 times a day, just to be sure that you've really finished out that infection and it's not going to come back the moment you stop taking the medicine. If you're dosing a child, it's going to be by body weight, so you're going to reduce the dose. And then because this is alcohol, just beware of that. You can also make a tea with pine needles, which might be more palatable for a child. And again, this is our basic tincture method for doing the folk method. And again, with 100 proof vodka, you can do this same exact method with rose hips, which you can go harvest this time of year, or you can order them online. You can do this with juniper berries this time of year, which you can go harvest. You might be able to find those to order as well. And throughout the year, there are other plants that work well with 100 proof vodka, but like I said, it's not all plants. There is a little bit of nuance, and if you want to get more into the details and nuances of other types of tinctures and how to know which plants to use which proof of alcohol for, then you can find me over on Patreon. This month I'm going to be posting a few more in-depth videos about tincture making if you want to find that over there. And if you're interested in the medicine of pine needles, you can find my pine medicine bundle for sale for $5 on Patreon. It has a medicinal monograph, a 2-page monograph of pine, an identification chart for the various pine species here, and it also includes 5 different recipes to use your pine needles in. So please let me know if you have questions about that. Hope you all have some happy tincture making.